Before considering the developments associated with Daniel 11:28, we left off with the king of the north plotting out schemes against his rival, and the two kings mustering their armies for a great war. As a side note, in the first edition of Jehovah Himself Has Become King, published in 2005, in the chapter on the King of the North, I expressed the implausibility of the Watchtower's interpretation applying to the defeat of ancient Syria and Queen Zenobia by Rome, and instead suggested that the description of an exceedingly large army and many falling down slain was fulfilled with the First World War. And what do you know? A few years ago, the Watchtower made an adjustment and applied the prophecy to World War I too. Except the Watchtower still clings to the notion that Kaiser Wilhelm's Germany and Hitler's Nazi Germany were the king of the North at that time. The challenge for anyone intent on understanding this prophecy is to factor in that history itself has been revised by historians, educators, and journalists who've been influenced by the empire. As the prophecy foretold, the king of the north will act effectively. Just how effective his campaign has been will be considered in this video. As regards the two opposed kings leading up to the time of the end, it is important to keep in mind that the real conflict is not between individual nations, but rather between private financial interests and sovereign nations. Naturally, though, the most prominent nation is the object of conquest. And without dispute, the United States of America has been the most dominant nation for the past century and more. In Part 3, we briefly considered how one aspect of prophecy was fulfilled with the British Empire's successful schemes to take over the financial affairs of America by surreptitiously installing the privately owned Federal Reserve Bank in 1913. The result has been far-reaching, and as of 2022, the private banking cartel has brought the King of the South to the brink of ruin. At this late date of terminal bankruptcy imposed upon the U.S., the Federal Reserve Bank can detonate an economic implosion and bring down the entire system by merely raising interest rates to what were previously considered normal levels. After the great slaughter of the First World War, the two rival kings sat at the same table and spoke lies. This was fulfilled with the convocation that ended the war, that produced the Treaty of Versailles, which historians recognize as laying the groundwork that made the rise of Nazism and the Second World War inevitable. At this point, the King of the North will go back to his land with a great amount of goods, and his heart will be against the Holy Covenant. He will act effectively and go back to his land. Although the prophetic kings of the North and South have persisted over the course of 2,500 years, and the domains of the kingdoms have changed over the course of time, the expression going back to his land does not signify a geographic location, but rather a policy position, specifically an intentional scheme of opposition towards God. It is well to keep in mind that the symbolic designations of north and south are in relation to God too. That is because the decorated land, so-called, belongs to God. Originally, the two kings of the north and south were literally north and south of the land of Israel. And Jehovah was the God of Israel. But Israel is no longer the land of the decoration. Christianity is. The Holy Covenant, therefore, which the king of the north is against, is in reference to the covenant between Jehovah and anointed persons, mediated by Jesus. In other words, Christianity, originating with the new covenant that Jesus instituted. As was considered in part 1, the king of the north became mighty by means of a little nation. What was the little nation? Again, it was Christ's congregation. The Apostle Peter said of those belonging to this nation, "But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for special possession, that you should declare abroad the excellencies of the one who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light." When Jesus was born, Rome's representative in Palestine unsuccessfully tried to murder the infant in the cradle. Eventually, though, through their appointee, the Roman king of the north presided over Jesus' execution. All during the apostolic era, Christians were persecuted and killed by both Jews and Roman rulers. During the height of persecution, Christians were slaughtered in the Colosseum for entertainment, and they were tied to poles along the streets of Rome and doused with oil and lit aflame to provide light. The horrific atrocity was no doubt Satan's twisted mockery of Jesus' disciples being the light of the world. But merely 2 centuries into the Christian era, the Emperor of Rome made Christianity the official religion of the pagan empire, even though less than 10% of the population even considered themselves to be nominally Christian. Although it was the corrupted form of Christianity, Christ was at least superficially honored in the realm of Christendom. Now, as regards the king of the north going back to his land, this means that the king resumes his open opposition to the God of the Bible and Christ, and the resumption of paganism as existed before Constantine adopted Christianity as the official religion of the empire. Again, although Christianity has been infused with paganism from the beginning, many aspects of Christianity have been respected. At the beginning of the 19th century, Bible societies proliferated in the English-speaking world, a direct result of King James having authorized the translation of the Bible into English. And of course, the invention of the printing press eventually resulted in the Bible being widely available. These developments led to a growing interest in the return of Jesus Christ, and ultimately to the establishment of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society and an unprecedented worldwide preaching campaign. But leading up to the appearance of an anointed congregation, the British Crown, which was also the head of the Church of England, subtly sponsored an anti-Christian movement that became the philosophical foundation of the empire. Even though he is head of the church, the king's heart is against the Holy Covenant. How so? A Around the beginning of the 19th century, Thomas Malthus, an honored graduate of Jesus College, published an essay on the principle of population, in which he argued, somewhat clumsily, that population growth will always outstrip food supply. Although the Industrial Revolution proved Malthus wrong 1,000 times over, nevertheless, his ideas were enshrined as Malthusianism, synonymous with depopulation. Here is an excerpt from his essay on overpopulation. All the children born beyond what would be required to keep up the population to this level must necessarily perish unless room be made by them by the deaths of grown persons. Therefore, we should facilitate instead of foolishly and vainly endeavoring to impede the operation of nature in producing this mortality. And if we dread the too frequent visitation of the horrid form of famine, we should sedulously encourage the other forms of destruction which we compel nature to use. But above all, we should reprobate specific remedies for ravaging diseases, and those benevolent but much mistaken men who have thought they were doing a service to mankind by projecting schemes for the total extirpation of particular disorders. Oh, the British have such a way of speaking so eloquently, don't they? Even when advocating the most unspeakable horrors. Well, instead of dismissing Thomas Malthus as a murderous quack, he was hired by the British East India Company, which was the largest monopoly on earth at the time. The British India Company was, in fact, the British Empire. The company established its own college to train future administrators. Thomas Malthus, Parson Thomas Malthus, was its first president and chief political economist. Apparently, the empire intended to use a prominent clergyman to soften the harshness of the genocidal implications of their overpopulation policy. Before the 19th century ended, the Malthusians starved millions in Ireland and on the Indian subcontinent, what has been called the Great Victorian Holocaust. Unfortunately, Malthusianism is not merely history. As stated already, combating overpopulation is the foundational platform of the British imperial system. To be sure, the pandemics and food shortages that are beginning to ravage the world now are the result of intentional policy decisions. What Malthus advocated was that physicians should cease trying to find remedies for various maladies and instead join in with nature in eliminating excess numbers of mankind. And that is exactly what the empire has brought about through the development of COVID-19 and the mRNA vaccines. Hospitals have been prevented from administering cheap and proven remedies and instead have killed hundreds of thousands with ineffective, powerful medicines. Let me read to you a quote from another eloquent Malthusian, the British Empire's own 20th century racist philosopher and someone who's been frequently quoted by the Watchtower, one Bertrand Russell. Quote, "The white population of the world will soon cease to increase. The Asiatic races will be longer, and the Negroes still longer before their birth rate falls sufficiently to make their numbers stable without help of war and pestilence. I do not pretend that birth control is the only way in which population can be kept from increasing. There are others which one must suppose opponents of birth control would prefer. War, as I remarked a moment ago, has hitherto been disappointing in this respect. But perhaps bacteriological war may prove more effective. If a Black Death could spread throughout the world once in every generation, survivors could procreate freely without making the world too full. There would be nothing in this to offend the conscience of the devout or to restrain the ambitions of nationalists. The state of affairs might be somewhat unpleasant, but what of it? And finally, the recently deceased Prince Philip stated on more than one occasion that if there is such a thing as reincarnation, he wishes to be reconstituted as a deadly virus in order to do his part in killing off as many of our race as possible. Another great admirer of Malthus was Charles Darwin. In fact, in the introduction to his book, Origin of Species, Darwin claimed that the doctrine of Malthus applied to the whole vegetable and animal kingdom, to which mankind was merely an insignificant part. How true the Bible's adage that the wisdom of this world is earthly and animal and demonic. Survival of the fittest means the rich crush the poor. According to the fake science of evolution, mankind is not made in the image of God, nor are men and women a little lower than angels in God's hierarchy of creation. No, humans are merely an accidental offshoot of the animal kingdom, with no higher standing than a grass-chewing beast. Thus, Darwinism has become the basis for New Age religion, the religion of environmentalism, officially known as Gaia. This is the religion of the British Empire and the United Nations. It is in every respect against the Holy Covenant. After all, if humans are just smarter apes, the sacrifice of Jesus Christ is null and void and entirely irrelevant. Salvation is not possible, nor is it necessary. According to the tenets of the New Age goddess religion known as Gaia, all creatures on earth are equal. That is a direct contradiction of the teachings of Jesus Christ, who assured his disciples that they were worth more than many sparrows, and of course, by extension, worth more than every other animal creature. Because industrialized civilization is causing distress and extinction to some species of equally important creatures and damaging the earth itself, the cult of the Gaia goddess has determined that the excess eaters and consumers devouring precious resources must be eliminated. Klaus Schwab, the founder of the misnamed World Economic Forum, shockingly admitted that the new Green Deal initiative is intended to prevent underdeveloped nations from developing or even living. Here's what he said. The same force that helps people escape from poverty and lead a decent life is the one that is destroying the livability of our planet for future generations. The emissions that lead to climate change are not just the result of a selfish generation of industrialist or Western baby boomers. They are the consequences of the desire to create a better future for oneself. Using climate change and the pretext to save future generations from the scourge of the present generation of carbon dioxide producers, the so-called globalists, the leaders of the British system, fully intend to bring about a global genocide that will make the Nazi Holocaust pale into insignificance. Darwin's Origin of the Species is a direct attack upon the Bible's account. The actual origin of species is explained in the book of Origin. Genesis means origin, and it informs us that Jehovah God created all things according to their kind. And that is exactly what we see in the natural world. Each species according to their kind. And lastly, God created humans in his image. Male and female, he created them. Humans are the crown of God's earthly creation, a special creation, separate and distinct from animals. Sure, we share the same planet, the same life support system, but there's a vast gulf between animals and humans. Around the time the imposter scientist published his Origin of Species, the American king of the South, Abraham Lincoln, reaffirmed what had been stated in the Declaration of Independence by America's founders, namely, that God created all men equal. So we see the dichotomy developing between the two inimical systems, one openly acknowledging that God is revealed in the Bible, and the other covertly opposed to it. As an interesting footnote of history, although Lord Palmerston recommended Darwin for knighthood, Queen Victoria, the head of the Anglican Church, thought it inappropriate for obvious reasons. Nevertheless, Darwin's personal war against God was taken up with greater zeal after Victoria passed the ruling scepter to her son. And the King of the North has waged an all-out campaign against Christian civilization for the past 150 years. Not coincidentally, coinciding with the sudden appearance of a grouping of anointed Christians that formed around the Watchtower from 1879 onward. After Franklin Roosevelt saved America from the Great Depression that the Lords of London had orchestrated, and after Russia and the USA defeated the Nazis in the Second World War, America emerged as the most powerful nation on earth. There was great optimism about the future. Then came the 1960s. The empire assassinated another American president, which was the opening shot in a cultural war aimed at destroying the very Christian foundation upon which the nation had been built. A massive dumbing down program was imposed upon the education system. The War of the Sexes began, aimed at destroying the marriage institution God had established between the first man and woman. To that end, the sacred matrimony between a husband and wife has been corrupted by gay and lesbian marriages. It has reached the point that a recently appointed female Supreme Court justice cannot even define what a woman is. Truth has become the enemy of the empire, even as is stated in the 8th chapter of Daniel regarding the beast to come. It kept throwing truth to the earth, and it acted and had success. London's Tavistock Institute has influenced the media to entertain the masses with more and more shocking violence and mindless stupidity, and always sexual immorality and steadily degrading depravity. Before reaching puberty even, children are being groomed to become transsexuals. Pedophilia is becoming normalized. What next? Cannibalism? Don't discount it. After the assassination of Kennedy, through channels controlled by British intelligence and their American counterparts like the CIA, college campuses were flooded with marijuana and LSD. Rock music was promoted and bankrolled by the very establishment that the counterculture railed against. Rock stars were idolized as gods. Drugs, sex, and rock and roll became the empire's secret weapon to create a paradigm shift. As a leading band in the aptly named British invasion of the 1960s, Sir Mick Jagger and the Rolling Stones appropriately entitled one of their albums, Their Satanic Majesty's Request. They were not joking. Jagger and other rockers have been knighted for their services rendered to the crown. By all accounts, the King of the North's war against the Holy Covenant has been very effective. The once proud land of the free has become enslaved by its skillfully nourished vices and pretentious folly. What had been Christian civilization, at least with a veneer, has been purposely made unfit to survive. Regarding the King of the North, Daniel's prophecy states, "He will show no regard for the God of his fathers." The God of his fathers is the God of the Judeo-Christian tradition. As pointed out already, the British crown is also the head of the Anglican Church. Since Constantine established the corrupt form of Christianity as the religion of the Roman Empire, all of the ruling powers of Christendom, his fathers, have honored the Trinity. Even though the doctrinal basis is entirely false, Jesus has at least been superficially honored. As if to emphasize the change that has been taking place gradually over the past century, since the King of the North began to war against the Holy Covenant, and as if to make it official, the leading prince of the British imperial system has recently presided over a thinly disguised pagan ceremony honoring the demons. True, the devil has always been the unseen power behind the earthly throne. But now that Satan is coming out of the shadows, in a short while we may expect the scheme of his earthly promoters to culminate with the brute force coercion to compel Jehovah's people to bow before their God.